Okay, so we're going to get started up with exercise 210. I apologize. I pre-posted to 11, so I screwed some of you up. We're still on 210. We're not moving that far. Recognize we're about a third of the way through the semester already, so time flies. Hopefully when you're having fun. Fingers crossed. So today we're going to take a step back from the intensive Rhino modeling stuff that we've been doing. And we're going to talk again about materials. So I weave in V-Ray constantly. But in order to really understand materials, we have to understand how they're made and how they act as materials. And learning these skills will, one, help you make your own material out of thin air. But more importantly, will help you understand how to tweak a material to actually look the way you want it to look. Because chances are there's a material that exists out there that is close to the material that you want to use. And it might take some tweaking, but you can actually get there. So I want to talk a little bit about how materials are made up. And I have some example sets of renderings to help kind of illustrate what's happening. So as part of a material, we have something that's called a diffuse texture, right? Which, and this is generic. Not every material has everything. It depends on exactly what material you're working with. But the diffuse image is basically the color texture that represents what it is. So in this case, I have like a corrugated piece of sheet metal, right? And so the diffuse texture is the photograph that represents what that material is. So if I were to pull it up as a single image, bear with me for just a second here. Oh, of course, I don't have it, right? Okay, well, let's see if I can. Of course not, right? So never mind, I can't pull it up. Basically it's a flat image that has no bump on it, nothing. It's just flat colored photograph. Okay? This is not what I wanted. We add to that, right, something that's called a bump map. And a bump is like little scratches on a surface. So if we looked at these desks, for example, right, there's little scratches, there's little grooves in between where they're glued together. If we looked at the computer monitor, there's like little plastic texture. You guys know what I'm talking about? That little stuff, right? That's a bump map. That would be the second layer. The third layer is something called a displacement map. And the displacement map is the actual ups and downs, the big stuff, right? So in the case of corrugation, it's the wave pattern, right? And then we combine all of those together to get what the actual material looks like. And so sometimes it helps to see a couple different examples. So let me move forward here or back. Okay, let's look at this one, right? This is like a piece of shingle siding, okay? The diffuse image is just the color version of it, okay? Nothing more. The next one down, which is called the bump map, is like the little grain that's on the saw marks that are on the texture itself. Does that make sense? Right? Then we move to the displacement map, and you can see right along the edge the shingle pattern, the taper. Right? That's what we're seeing in this. And then we combine them together. It's not the best slide in the world. It's a little dark. We get the little stuff, and we get the big wave. Okay? We can add to that. Let me see. Right? Something where, in this case, it's a piece of sheet metal. We don't have a lot of scratches on the surface. It's just a flat piece of metal, right? But we might have a bump map. It depends on the metal itself. But we certainly don't have a displacement because it's just flat, right? So there's no ups and downs. But we'd add something called a transparency map that says these are the hollow areas. This is where we're punching through, and these are the solid areas. So all of these are separate files in Rhino or in V-Ray, and we can control which ones are doing what. Okay? So I'll do some live examples, and this stuff will make more sense as we go forward. Here's another example, right, where we have the flat image, right? We have a little bit of bump on this because it's a wire. It has a little bit of texture to it, right? Then we have the transparency, which is what's a hole, what gets cut through, and then we end up with the ultimate wire mesh look, right? So it's a combination of these images that we work through. If I look at a given material, right, let me go ahead and I'm going to open up. By the way, on today, you're going to be working with a sample file. So if we go to exercises and we go to today's exercise, it's 210. there's this materials test 3DM. You're going to save this to your flash drive. And then I'm going to go ahead and open that. And this is a very generic scene that's set up with a box and a sphere that's sitting on top of it, and a little directional light and an infinite plane. Right? So there's not too much to the scene, but it's a good way of kind of practicing with how this stuff works and seeing what it looks like in two different styles of object. Okay? So let's start investigating material. I'm going to pick some existing materials first, and then we'll look at those pieces of the material and kind of how they work. Okay? So let's go ahead, and I'm going to load a material. And these are the ones that I've already pre-made. I'll go to siding. I'm going to go to a wood siding, and I'll go to that the shingle siding, which I showed you an example of. And I'll go ahead and I'll load that. Okay, which shows up as a shingle siding. So if I look over here in my material itself, we have a drawer called diffuse, which was the color when we changed the color. It has a photograph that's been applied. And that's done under the color section. There's a capital M. If I click on that, I'll get to the diffuse map here. I can click on preview, and I'll see just the flat image that represents it. If I went to my flash drive into my materials, I could actually open that on its own. Nope. Resources, materials, siding. Right? If I'm looking at it here, there's the diffuse. If I opened it, right, just a plain image, no texture applied to it. Okay? The next piece, right, so we'll go ahead and say, okay, if I were to render this, let me turn off the bump and the displacement, and let me apply this to my object so that we can see it. And I'm just going to apply it directly here. Selection, and I were to render it. We would get the shingle texture applied, and it looks like it has a little bit of texture on it just because the photograph has some texture on it. The photograph has a little bit of shadow, and so it looks like it's 3D. But if we look carefully on the edge here, it's just a straight edge, so nothing's sticking out for us. So if I come back and I go, let me zoom in for reference here, zoom in right on this edge, and I'll do one more render for reference. Okay, so if we look at it, once again, that edge is straight, nothing sticking out. It's just a flat surface. Okay? If I come back to my materials, right, we did diffuse, and I come down here under the maps drawer. And under maps, I have the ability to choose a bump map and a displacement map. Okay? The bump map is the small scale texture. It's the texture of the plastic of the monitor. It's that kind of texture, right? Nothing big. So if I turn on the bump map, it's a loaded file. It's called shingles bump, which I can also pull up in my flash drive for reference. There it is as bump. If we look at it, we have kind of a black and white image, right? The blacks and the whites represent little distortions, right? So this is an approximation of the texture, but we get some striations that are in blacks and whites, and those will represent that. So if I go back to Rhino here, right, the bump has been applied. I'll say OK. I also have something called a value next to it, right? This increases how much of this little texture I'm going to see, right? So I have it set right now at 0.5. That's what seems appropriate to me. Let me go ahead, and with that on, we'll do another rendering. I'm going to render right on top of this, and we'll see if we can distinguish a little bit of a difference. And it's always hard on a projector for you to see it, but where in fact, as it's finishing, you can see those little pieces that are standing out in the grain. You see that a little bit on the projector? Right? That grain is standing out. I could come back to my material, and I could increase this value to say maybe 10, and I could re-render. and we should get much more of it standing out. Right, it should be a bigger standout. I'm trying to see if I can exaggerate it. Oops. Try 100. Yeah, it's definitely standing out more now. Right? So you have to kind of figure out what the right value is based on the look of your texture. To me, this is way too much of the texture, but you have to kind of see what fits with your particular piece. So I'll go back to materials, and I'm going to turn this back down to 0.5, which I thought was enough. And then we'll move on to the displacement. So now the displacement isn't controlling the small details. It's controlling the fact that the shingles do this. Right? So if we look at the displacement file, we have a very stagnant piece that goes from a sharp black edge to kind of a grayish piece. The truth is that since these shingles have a keyway, which basically means a gap between the shingles, right, the gradient goes from black all the way back down to white here because this shingle is then on top of the shingle that's below it. So we're creating a little bit of a layered effect. Right? The simplest version would be black on one edge, white there, and that's it. This is a little bit more complicated to give a little bit better result. Okay? So I'm going to apply this as a displacement map. So let's go back into Rhino. I'm going to turn on displacement. Now, you can see that the map is here. There it is. It is actually the inverse of the one that I have drawn. We had to check the box for invert. I get the which one's black and which one's white mixed up as to which one stands out. So half the time when I make these materials, I make them backwards. But there is an invert checkbox to flip it. So if we flip it, we're just going, this front edge is white, the back edge is black. It's a mental thing. I have trouble keeping track, but I know the invert button is there, so I never bothered to really learn. Okay, so I'll go ahead and say OK. Now, there's also a value for displacement. This value is actually tied to the units that are in your scene. So assuming that I'm using a model that's in units of inches, right, this value is then in inches. So the difference between white and black is an inch value that's specified here. So in this case, the difference between white and black is 1/2 inch. So that little bump is going to stick up, or the displacement is going to stick up by 1/2 inch. Okay? So I'll set that at 1/2 inch, and then we'll go ahead and render again. Notice that when I start this, the rendering process slows down significantly, right? Because this takes a lot more effort on the render engine's part, on V-Ray's part, to actually do this, right? Because no longer is it a flat surface. It's actually a surface that has some slope to it and has some displacement to it. So as we look at this edge, hold on one second, right, where that was a straight line, it's now looking like a set of shingles. Okay, now question.
When you're rendering, does it go faster if you just do a smaller piece? Or?
Yes, the setting for this is such that it really doesn't matter because the whole size that I'm rendering right now is only 800 by 600. When we add displacements plus reflections, we can get to a point where we can really choke down the system, in which case we're going to start network rendering so we can get a lot more power out of it. Right? But for right now, it's still fine. If we look here, going up the top, we can really see that displacement. Right? And we can see it on the edge there. Okay? We can even see it in between the shingles, right, which was the idea. So at 1/2 inch, at this close, maybe it's a little bit too much. Maybe we need to tone it down. Right? But let's exaggerate a little bit more. Right? Let me go at maybe 5 inches. Let's go 2. 5 is going to be way too big. Right? And let me go ahead and render. Because I want you to see this as a contrast. And it's clearly not doing what I want it to do. Let's increase that value even higher. All right, so this was at 10 inches, right, which we're basically seeing almost nothing because it's sticking out 10 inches. So maybe that's too far. All right, so let's go back. I should have gotten a better result out of 2 inches. There we go. So where these shingles used to be at a 1/2 inch, they're now at 2 inches thick. So I can really change what this surface is looking like, right? And the important thing to recognize in this, and I know I'm getting some weird distortions in here, but this is obviously exaggerated and too big to begin with. The important thing to recognize is that if I want a surface that has this texture, I don't actually have to model it in Rhino, right? Let's say I wanted that corrugated texture that's the wave. I don't actually have to do that wave and extrude it to make that surface. I can do a flat surface and make it in V-Ray, right? So I don't have to do the geometry. Likewise, if I have a bunch of holes punching through something, I don't actually have to apply the holes on the surface in Rhino. I can do it after the fact in V-Ray, right? So it saves a lot of modeling down the road. Okay, so that example is with shingle siding. Let's try a few others just so we get used to it. Let me go ahead and go to my materials. And let me load like a wire mesh or something here. Metal screens. Actually, let me load the matte one so we don't have quite so much reflection here. And I'll open. Okay. And so let's take a look at the round holes. Okay, if I preview it just so that we can see it, it's this texture, right, where I have a metal background and I have the little round punches through it. Okay, if we look at it, because it's metal, we have a reflection, right? So we'll get to reflections and reflection maps in a second. Oh, thanks, V-Ray. There we go. So we'll skip reflection. If we look at diffuse, right, I actually don't have a diffuse map applied, because it's just kind of a solid gray color, and I'm doing a reflection on top of it to mimic what metal looks like. So I don't actually have a photograph of metal here, I just have a gray. I do, however, have a capital M next to transparency, right? So this is a different kind of map. This is the third kind that we talked about. If I click on M, right, I end up with a transparency map that is a black and white image. Let me go ahead and pull that up out of my V-Ray materials. This is metal screens. This is the round holes matte, right? And so I have what's called a transparency, right? So this is basically a black and white image. The black areas are what gets cut through. The white areas are what remains solid, I think, right? Again, it's one of those that could be inverted. All right, so let me jump back here, right? Looks like the white is what is cut through and the black is what is solid. So I was backwards, okay? So when I go ahead and say OK, actually, let me turn off this for just a second. I'm going to go to none, and we'll apply it to these objects. And let me render. Okay, so as we look at it, we'll focus in on this little corner here because we don't need to let it render all the way. Because I turned off that transparency map, right? Everywhere there's a hole is black. It's just solid, right? As opposed to being able to see through that corner. So let's instead go back to my materials. Let's turn on that transparency map. And I'm going to pick it there. Say OK. Now if I preview it, we'll see that it's transparent. Those little black circles will go away. Looks like I had it backwards. Hold on. Invert. There we go. Now they're transparent that way, which is what I want. See, I can see right through there. So if I go ahead and do the sorry. If I go ahead and do the render, instead of having those black holes, we're going to be able to see through to the holes that are on the backside. Now, recognize I have a front surface, a top surface, and a back surface with 3 sets of holes. Now V-Ray has to calculate, right, what's transparent, but also what's reflective of what. So it's going to bounce a few times, so this render is going to slow down even more. And I'm probably going to have to start network rendering soon. But let's just bear with me for a second while this processes. Actually, you know what? I'll just turn off the reflections for a second. And this will render quickly. Amazing how fast when you take away the reflections. All right, so where this used to be a solid, right, it now has a metal mesh where I can see through the metal mesh into the other pieces. So the transparency map is controlling where the holes are. So the point here is you don't have to make a surface that has a bunch of holes in it anymore. If you have the map, no matter what it looks like, right, you can apply the transparency to a solid surface. Okay, so it's saving the actual modeling of geometry in Rhino. Okay, so in this particular case, we also have that reflection, which is what makes it look like metal. Right now, it just looks like kind of a gray plastic or something. So that's another piece, is certainly the reflection. What we're concentrating on today is the transparency map, the bump map, and the displacement map. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is I want you to go online, and there's a variety of sources that are out there. If you do a Google search for V-Ray materials, you'll find a bunch of them. The RenderBox Studios V-Ray materials are pretty good. Which is vraymaterials.co.uk. The thing about it is a lot of V-Ray materials are meant for 3D Studio Max, not Rhino. Okay? So if we were to pick one, and I'm going to pick one of these cloth materials, right? This is a gray linen material, and I were to click on download, it's free. Good. Let's go ahead and start download. Download now. Right, there it is. It's going to come down as a zip file. So let me go ahead and show in the folder. And I'll look at this material. Come on, let me see. Okay, so I have I'm going to need to extract this. So let me extract it first, because it's not going to let me preview it. Extract all. And because there's lots of files associated, I want subfolders because it'll help keep me a little organized here. So go ahead and say OK, and I'll click Extract. And there we go. So it comes with, right, a material file, which isn't going to help us because we can't load that because it's for 3D Studio, not for Rhino. Okay, so different file format. So that information isn't going to help us. However, we do have what's called a bump, and whatever they call, the render is the preview, and they have a diffuse. Okay? So I'm going to rebuild this material right now on the fly. So I'm going to go into V-Ray. I'm going to go to Material. I'm going to right-click and say Create New Material. This is just a standard material. Let's rename this to be Canvas Linen. And I'll go ahead and say OK. All right, so now I'm going to look at this canvas linen, and the first thing that I need is I need it to have the diffuse material. So I'm going to come to diffuse. I'm going to apply the photograph. So I'll do it right here under the color section. I'll click on M for material. I'm going to select from this list text bitmap, which basically means a picture. And I'm going to go to my flash drive, into my folder here. There's the canvas. And I'm going to pick the linen, the canvas linen, because that's the actual image. I'll go ahead and say Open. And I'll say OK. And if I look at my preview, I now have the linen material that's been applied. I have no bump. I have no texture associated with it yet, but I have that material. So if I were to right-click and say Apply Material to Selection, and then I were to render, we would have the linen material applied to these shapes. Okay? So let me go ahead and add a little bit more to it. Remember, the file that I downloaded had a bump associated with it. If we look at the file itself here, right, there's a file for bump, right, which is essentially a black and white version of it. I'm going to go ahead and load that in as well. So I'll check the box for bump. I'll click on the M for the map. I'll change this to text bitmap. And I'll choose bump. I'll say OK. And I'll say OK. And now I'm going to have a bump. And so I'll set the value at 1. Right? And I'll go ahead. This has already been applied. And I'll go ahead and do the render. And that looks about right for how much of the little bit of texture that I added. Okay? If it didn't seem like enough, I'd add more. I'd increase that value. If it seemed like too much, I'd decrease that value. Okay? So now that I have this with its texture applied, I'm pretty happy with it. So I'm going to do a few things to set this up to save it. Right? And you're going to do this 4 times today. Right? So first thing that I'll do is I'm going to set the view. I'm going to go to Set View, Render Material Test, which centers everything and makes it consistent. I'll go ahead and do a render. Which renders out the object in its final form. I'm going to click on the Save icon. And let me go to today. And this was under Canvas. And I'm going to save it here. And I'll call this Canvas Sample. And I'll click Save. All right. Then I also need to pack the material for later. So I'm going to go to the Materials. I'm going to go to Canvas Linen. I'm going to right-click on it. And I'm going to say Pack Material. All right. It's called Canvas Linen. I'm going to put it inside here. And I'll go ahead and click on Save. Etc. So now I'm going to jump over to the course website. And lo and behold, some of you may have discovered this already. Under Resources, we can go to V-Ray Materials Library. And there is a bunch of materials that people have done, relatively categorized. Okay, so we're going to save it into this group of materials too. Okay, the ones with the little DTFA on it are ones that I did. And so I put that on it so you know it's something that I made instead. OK, so I need to make a post. So I'm going to go to New, Post. All right, and so this is going to be a Canvas Linen. Right? And I need to add, first thing, I'm going to set my featured image to be that rendered image. So I'll go to Set Featured Image. I'm going to go to Upload Files, Select File. And it was Canvas Sample. There it is. I'll go ahead and set the featured image. All right, then I need to actually put the file in. So I'll say this is the package. All right, and then I'll go ahead and add the media. And this time I'm going to upload that packed zip file right there, Canvas Linen. And we'll upload that. When it's done, I will click on Insert into Post. And there it is. And let's make it look nice. I'll put a little list in front of it. Right? And then over here, since this is Digital Tools for Architects 136, it's exercise 210. Right? But I'm going to continue down after I make those, and I'm going to find the category called V-Ray Materials. Right? And so you guys did this with blocks. It's the same thing. This time, this is going to be a fabric. Right? Doesn't look like I have canvas, so I'm going to add a sub. This will be canvas. And this would be a fabric. And I'll add that. And I might also add linen. And this is, again, going to be under fabric. Right? And let's look down here and see if I have something for color. No, I don't. So we'll just go with it. Okay, so when I'm done, I'll go ahead and come up here, and I'll click on Publish. And I've now created. Now, since I got this from the V-Ray Materials.co.uk, it would be nice if I linked back to them. So I'm going to say copy, that link, and I'll jump back to my post, and I'll say material 3 X. And we'll link this to their website to be nice, because we actually borrowed it from them. It's nice to do that. Okay. So, and we'll go ahead and click on update. So now they have the original, they have the Vismat that'll work for V-Ray and Rhino, and I've created my post. You're going to do 4 of these, okay, and pick things that are interesting to you, things that you think that you would use. Recognize right now you're going to be making your chairs and your tables, which are due next week. Perfect example to try to go find the materials that you want for those, right? You can, of course, use the ones that people have already created in this class, ones that I gave you, the download package that you have, but you can also create your own, okay? So spend some time looking at that. If you finish early, right, by all means, start working on your table and chairs. You should have time. This whole process is you can actually make it entirely on your own, so you don't have to borrow somebody else's material. Most of you have not taken 135, so you don't have to do it completely from scratch. If you've done it, if you've taken 135 and you're comfortable in Photoshop, I'm going to make another part to this lecture where I'll actually show you how to make it live from Photoshop, because it's useful for some of you. But for those of you that don't know Photoshop, it's not required for this class. Right? So I just want to say that now is the break point where I'll go off on a tangent, and you can either ignore me or you can follow along with that part of it too. Okay? Are there any questions about this so far? No? Good. Okay. So why don't we, I'll give it like 5 minutes because I want to stop this recording, and then I'll start another recording for the second half. Okay? So give me like 5 minutes to finish up, and then I'll continue with Photoshop. Okay, so as I promised, I was going to go through how to create something entirely from scratch. If this is not something, if you don't feel comfortable in Photoshop, remember it's not required that you do it. It is part 2B, basically, of the exercise that I handed out, so you can follow step by step through. But I want to at least walk through it so you can see how this process would work, and maybe it'll incite, make you want to take a Photoshop class or something. I don't know, right? Probably not so much, not as much as when we get to the final collage work and stuff. Anyway, so I seem to have a lack of roofing materials, so when I do examples, I tend to try to pick roofing materials so I can build up roofing materials. So I'm going to do a metal roof. I pulled out a couple different ones. This one might not be bad. Basically, I did an image search for a metal roof, and so I could pick any one of these as an example, and I'm going to show you kind of how to work with them. But again, it's up to you. I'll start with this first one. It's a small enough piece. I think it'll repeat nicely, so I'll work with that. This is a Flickr image, so I'm going to go ahead and download this photo in its original size. And then I want to show in a folder. And then this is what I want to ultimately open in Photoshop. So let me go ahead and open with. Of course, it's not listed there, so why not? Let me go to Photoshop. And again, so Photoshop is beyond the scope of this class, but I think it's still worth showing you this part because it shows you that if you master all of these tools, you'll be able to create your own if you need it. And a lot of times as the semester goes along, people will, like, oh, don't you have this? And I forget, there was one time somebody needed a travertine, somebody needed a really whitish concrete to do a rendering for their skyscraper or whatever. And of course, I like to try to help you out, so I'll try to make them and whatever as we go along. So that we end up with more materials. Anyway. Let me get to that downloads folder, which of course is nowhere convenient for me. That's not it. There it is, and let me go ahead and open it. Okay, so here it is. So I've got a couple problems. One is that this isn't quite aligned correctly, so if I were to start tiling it, it wouldn't match up. So I need to make some adjustments to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to the View menu here, and I'm going to turn on Rulers. So it's View Rulers, and then I can drag little guides down from each of the rulers or across, that I can use to help me line up this image. So first off, I'm going to line up to that point there, and I want this edge to come over that direction. So I'm going to go to under, it's a locked background layer right now, so I have to unlock it so I can actually do this. So let me go ahead and say layer from background, which makes it an editable layer. And then I can come up into the edit menu, and I can go to transform skew. And skew is really, you could use warp or distort. They're a little bit harder to control. For this purpose, I think skew is great because it's very easy to control. Because all I do is I grab one corner of my image and I pull it, and we can see that it's straightening up. Right? And I have that right at about the center all the way along. Okay? I'm going to drag another line out over to this side, and I'm going to adjust this edge. See how it's not quite there yet? So we'll pull this one that direction. Right? And in the process, we lost a little bit over here. So it's a combination of pulling from one side and pulling from the other side until you get it dialed in so that these are now straight. Okay? I'm going to do the same thing for the tops and the bottoms. It doesn't really matter too much because I'm going to end up cropping this out, and as long as they're consistent side to side. But just in case, we'll do a little bit more. So I'll push this one up a little bit. About there. Now it's even all the way along with that set. And we'll do one more up here. And I'll pull this up like that. Right. Now I have to double check that I haven't lost any of my skew here. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. OK, so I'll go ahead and say OK. And now I've kind of isolated this piece of my image. Right? Now I need to actually do a crop and start to stitch this together. So I'm going to go back to my move tool, and I want to move this so that it falls halfway on the middle, because when I end up seaming these together, it's going to be easier to make the seam right on the, let me move it, right on the center of that, just like it is on the center there. Okay? Likewise, I'll move this up slightly, and I'll move this down slightly, so that I'm taking kind of a chunk right out of here in the center of this image. Okay? So now that I have that kind of aligned for myself, I'm going to go to the crop tool right here, and I'm going to drag my crop tool down so that I'm cropping just that piece of the image that I wanted right there. So I'll go ahead and say OK, and I end up with, press Control-0, this little piece of roof, okay, which is already close to a tiling texture. It's going to be pretty close, which is what I was after. Now, in order to make it tile, right, and repeat seamlessly end to end to end, I'm going to do something that's called the offset filter. And so what the offset filter does is it's going to take an image. I drew this morning because we were talking about it in class this morning. Right? It's going to take an image that looks like this, and it's going to split it here and here on those orange lines, and then it's going to rearrange the pieces. And I probably should have drawn these in orange. Right? It's going to rearrange the pieces so that piece 2 comes down to here. Right? Piece 1 comes down to here. Right? 4 goes up to there, and 3 goes up to there. And what that gives us is some area that we can work with on each side, or right in the middle here, that if we make it look seamless there, we know that it will tile the rest of the direction. Right? So if I were to continue to draw the other pieces, right, and I were to come here and draw this piece, and this piece, and this piece, right, I'd end up with the other half like that. Does that make sense? Right? This is how we know that it tiles. So I'm going to use this offset filter to do this. So I'll go up to Filter, and I'll go to Other, and then Offset. And as I do that, we can see that it's offsetting, right, in one direction and the other. I want to make sure that I have, that's my vertical, right, I want that about in the middle. And my horizontal, I want to make sure that I can see the horizontal. I did a pretty darn good job with the seam, so I think it's right here. So you really don't see it, okay, which is good. I don't have to do much to it. So I'll go ahead and say OK. Right? Now I have to do a little bit more adjustments, so because we can still see that line, so I need that line to go away. I'm going to use a tool called the Clone Stamp tool, which allows me to copy from one area over to another area. And I'm also going to increase my brush size and decrease my hardness so that it's a nice diffuse brush. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy, say from right here, over that seam. And I hold down Alt to choose where I'm copying from. Something like that. Right. When I get to this edge, I want to go across the edge like that. Copy from this edge right there. Photoshop does a really good job of showing you the preview. So again, Alt is where I'm selecting the sampling point. And then where I click is where it goes away. Okay, so let me sample across this again. Let's go to right there. Start to make that line disappear. We'll copy across these points as well. Once again, we need to copy from right there. Looks pretty good. Still seeing a little bit in there. Let's get rid of that. OK, so I've got this looking pretty good from a seamless standpoint. It's very hard to see, right? If I wanted to confirm that this works, let me press Control- for a second here. Just so that you can see this in operation, I'm going to go and adjust my canvas size temporarily. And then I'm going to copy it and paste it and show you that it, in fact, tiles. Let me turn off those guides. I'm going to view, show, uncheck guides. There. There. Sorry, it looks like this one was off a little bit. There. Anyway, I can keep pressing V, and you can see that this ends up being an infinite tile in any direction that I want it to go. Right? Relatively easy to create. So let me step back a few to where I have just this image again. And now I want to look at it from another perspective. So first off, I want to think about a bump. Does this have any small scale texture that's on it? Right? It probably does, but it's going to be a little bit hard for me to get good small scale texture other than I can convert the image to black and white, and I can use it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and convert it to black and white. I'm going to do that by doing an adjustment layer. I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to do a channel mixer to create it. And this is Photoshop 1.2 in the tutorials if you wanted to do it. I think it's 1.2. So you can follow along with that if you wanted. I'll go ahead and say OK. I'll check the box for monochrome. It becomes black and white. But because I really want this to be kind of punchy, I'm going to go through some of the other filters and see if I can get something with a little more grain to it. So that preset's not bad. Let me throw a levels adjustment on it as well. And if you were in 135, this shouldn't look too unfamiliar, right? Let's just make it a little bit more contrasty so that we get some darks and some lights in that. I might actually pull this and exaggerate it just a little bit, like that. Because again, it's not about what it looks like. It's about that I'm going to use it as part of the texture. All right? These darker areas can represent some dirt or something that's on it. And so we'll go ahead and use this as is. So I've got my first image here. Let's go ahead and save that. And let me go into my flash drive if I can find it. And we create a new folder. I'll call this Copper Roof. And we'll rename this to be a JPEG. And I'm going to call this Copper Roof. And I'm going to append underscore diff for diffuse, just so that I have that as a reference point. I'll go ahead and click Save. It's fine. And then I'm going to turn on my black and whites, and I'll go to File, Save As, and we'll save this one as a JPEG as well. Oops, it would help if I went back to my flash drive here. Right, only this one is going to be the bump. and I'll go ahead and click Save. Now the last piece is I need that, and we can turn these off again, I need to indicate where it steps up, right? And I have to understand whether it's going to step up as a sharp step or a not so sharp step. Okay, so in this, if I was looking at this in section, right, I have a flat piece of roof, then it kind of goes up, and then it goes over, and then it goes up. Right? So if I was drawing this as a displacement map, right, I'd have to have something that looks like this, where this was filled in, and this was filled in. Right? If I didn't want it to have a sharp edge, and I wanted it to be like arced, for example, instead of having black, white, or white and black, I'd have a gradient that went from white, darker, 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 darker to black. And that would cause it to be arced rather than sharp jump. Right? So I'm controlling it by how much gray it has. In this case, it doesn't have, it's a pretty sharp jump. I don't want it to be too rounded over, so it's really easy to make. So let me go ahead and create a new layer. And I'm going to do this on the new layer. I'll create a rectangular marquee over each of these little standing seams, something like that. I'll hold down Shift to add to the selection. I'll put that in. And I'll put that in. Now I need to paint those with black. And again, remember, I don't remember whether it's black or white, but it doesn't matter. Right? So we'll go ahead and paint that, paint that, paint that. And again, this is on a new layer. And then let me go to Select and then Inverse. And I'm going to paint white and paint this. Make the brush bigger. It's taking too long. Okay? And so now I have a black and white image that will cause those little seams to jump up. Okay? So I'll go ahead and go to File, Save. And let me go to a JPEG. And this would be displacement. And I'll click Save. Okay? If I wanted it to be more rounded, I could use something called the Gaussian blur to do it, which is under Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur. And then I can choose how much I want the radius to be. And you can kind of see how it, depending on how much I do, it'll blur the edges. And that would round over the edges. I'm going to create one with a little bit of a rounded edge, maybe even a little bit more, something like that, just so that you can see the difference. Okay, so I'll do this as well. Let me go to File, Save for Web, or excuse me, Save As. I'll go to JPEG, not the CD drive. I don't even think they make CDs anymore. And we'll go to 210, copper roof, right? And so this was displacement. And I'm just going to say V2 because I want you to be able to see the difference. So I'll go ahead and say OK. So now we'll jump over into Rhino, and we'll go ahead and make this material. So I'll right-click on Scene Materials, Create Material, and let's do a standard material. Okay. First thing that I have to do is load the color version. So I'll click on the M under Diffuse. I'll go to Text Bitmap, and I'll pick my copper roof diffuse. Say OK. And if I were to preview the material right now, I'd get the copper roof, which is exactly what I want. Let's go ahead and rename this to copper roof for cleanliness. OK, so now I have the copper roof. I come down to Bump. I check the box. We go to Material, Text Bitmap. This is going to be Bump. Go ahead and say OK. And we'll leave the value at about 1. But again, I have to try it out to see. So let me go ahead and apply the material to the selection, and then we'll do a render and see. It's there. I think it's probably a little too much because metal's pretty smooth. So that might have been a little bit too much. So let me jump this down to maybe 0.25 or so. Now I'm going to check the box for displacement, and I'll again click on the map. This time I'm going to load up my text bitmap, and I'm going to load up the displacement, and I'll say OK. Now in this case, about an inch is probably right for this kind of a roof. It probably does stick up about an inch, so I'll leave it at 1. We can look on the preview, and we'll see it stick up a little bit. Looks like I did it backwards. Let me go back here and check the box for invert. There we go. So it's sticking up. I'm looking at that little preview. And now let's go ahead and zoom in a bit in my scene, maybe, so we can kind of see it. Right? My texture mapping is too tight. I'm getting these too dense together. I need to extend them out. But basically, I'm getting a bump that sticks up at each point. Okay? And you can probably see it better right here is probably the best example. My bump map is still too strong. I'm getting too much texture out of it. In reality, I might just eliminate it altogether. You have to kind of play around with it a little bit. But my texture mapping, like I said, is definitely too big. So let's go back to a 1. Let's go back down to a 2. And let me turn off this, and maybe I'll do this at 0.5. And again, it's a lot about how it looks in reality. And we'll go ahead and render it one more time and see. Much better. Right? And so we can see the edge probably the best right here. So I'll do a close-up rendering here. So right there is that little piece that stands up. If I increase the displacement map, I can increase that value. So I put it at 0.5. If I go back up to 1 and I render, that's going to stick out more. So instead of sticking out that little bit, it's going to stick out double. So there it is, sticking out double. Okay? So one of the things that's important to understand about this is that when I do this displacement and the sun is in the scene casting shadows, notice the shadow changes and accommodates, and actually we get a shadow from that displacement in the surface. So that doesn't exist in Rhino's model. It's just in the V-Ray part that's adding that depth to it. So it's a really powerful tool to be able to do something like that. Okay, so this was with the straight displacement map. If I were to switch, oops, the displacement maps to the version 2 that had the rounded corners, and I were to render it, instead of this sharp piece, I get one that swoops up. So instead of being a step, it's a smooth. So if we go back to that original example that I showed you in the beginning of class today, if I can get to it, this one, right? This is a gradient. It's a black to white gradient that repeats itself that creates the wave pattern. Right? That's how I get the slopes in between, as opposed to steps for each layer. Does that make sense? Okay? So that would be the process in Photoshop of actually creating a material from scratch. right? Now, in reality of this particular piece, if I came back in, this probably has a little bit of shine to it too. So I'd come back to my materials. All right, let me correct the displacement map again. So it's back to displacement 1. Okay. It probably has some reflection to it. So let me go ahead and create layer reflection. Right. I don't want it to be too much reflection. So under let's go under highlight. We'll go to 0.5, and reflect. We'll go to maybe 0.5. So we get a little bit of shine off of it, but not too much. Right. And so now if we were to render it. Right, again, it's going to take a little bit longer, but we'll have just a little bit of shine on it. And if this is too much shine, then obviously I'm going to have to tone that value down. Okay, so I'll let this finish, but this is essentially the summary of the variables that play into a particular material. If you download a material like a metal or a gold or something, it might not have a diffuse. It might just be some settings, in which case it's much harder to mimic. If it's one that comes with a diffuse color, it's a little bit easier to work with at this stage. Okay? All right, so that's it.